Thanks for asking me to join. This series has been really beneficial for myself, and I'm sure a lot of others.
Looks
Yeah,
good.
so all right, good to go. My name's Wendal Kane. I'm the range ecologist for the Spokane Tribe of Indians here in northeastern Washington. I pretty much oversee all of the noxious weed management efforts on the reservation. So I'm going to just kind of walk everyone through our integrated weed management plan and talk about why these are useful tools and how they've helped us implement a more efficient noxious weed management program. So first question should be, why do we need a weed management plan at all? And the rationale behind that is that noxious weeds harm our natural resources and our agricultural resources. Infested ecosystems don't function as well. They can have diminished wildlife habitat. They diminish cultural resources, water quality. They inhibit recreational opportunities. The list just goes on and on. And a big point to make is that they can cause an increase in wildfire frequency. You know, a lot of us are familiar with cheatgrass and invasive annual grasses, just how hot and intense those fires can be. In addition, noxious weeds limit agricultural returns. They lower crop yields. Having weed seeds in your grain, hay crops, seed crops lowers its value on the market. We're starting to see a lot of certified weed-free products out there. So producers are competing with weed-free certifications. So those weeds really hinder those sales. And some noxious weeds are actually toxic to livestock. So if you get in some St. John's wort or something like that in your pastures, you know, you're just reducing the health of your animals, which for a lot of farmers is their livelihood. So we need to manage weeds, and we need some sort of guiding document to manage those weeds. And so prior to developing a noxious weed management plan out here, our weed control efforts were sort of spotty. We have different departments like our water resources department, our wildlife department, our forestry department, all managing weeds separately, but not necessarily coordinating those efforts between themselves. And very little success monitoring was happening. Additionally, in burned areas, there was little to no weed management funding coming through the burned area emergency response funds. And we didn't really have anyone or any document kind of advocating for the need to fund these invasive species projects. And then lastly, in 1986, a reservation-wide grazing inventory estimated that 35% of the Spokane reservation was to some level infested with noxious weeds. So we knew we needed a plan. And when we started developing the plan and kind of realizing that we needed one, we started collecting our data. So on the map on the right here, you can kind of see that our data was pretty minimal. We just had some point locations of where weeds were at. There's no level of prioritization. So when we started the process, we worked with some contractors to write our plan. They had to have tribal programs gather this data, and then they also surveyed these programs for input on noxious weed management efforts. And then another big aspect of that is they surveyed the tribal community for input on noxious weed efforts. Rightfully so, a lot of folks are wary of herbicide use, and without a noxious weed plan out there, we tend to just rely on herbicides when there's definitely other management methodologies instead of herbicides. So that started the process, and we now have an integrated weed management plan. The funding for the plan was acquired through the BIA, and that also funded our initial reservation-wide noxious weed surveys. That all started in 2021. So definitely reach out to your BIA contacts. They're a great resource for for any sort of management plan. It doesn't just have to be noxious weeds. I mean, we have a lot of diseases out there, like CWD, a lot of invasive fish and other aquatic organisms. So they're definitely a big help there. So we contracted the production of this plan through Northwind Resource Consulting with those BIA funds. And I mean, the point of this plan is just to guide and prioritize our weed management activities for all of our DNR departments. And finally, the integrated weed management plan went through the NEPA process with an environmental assessment and a finding of no significant impact, which is really important for getting federal dollars. You really need to get your plan through that NEPA process, which looks like we'll be hearing a little bit more later. And so, yeah, here's just the kind of cover page of our environmental assessment. And so in our plan, this images and quote are taken directly from our weed management plan. There's a focus on integrated. And so what does integrated weed management mean? There's a lot of different tools out there for management efforts. And it really starts with education and prevention. If people you work with or people that live in your community don't know about noxious weeds, then they don't know that maybe they should take more time to spray off their rigs after going in the field, or spraying off their logging equipment if they're switching between project areas. So it's much cheaper to prevent noxious weeds than to have to spray them or mow them. And a big focus on the integrated weed management aspect is the 3 other methods besides chemical applications. So we have biological methods, which could be grazing or releasing insects that prey on that noxious weed species and no other species. We also have mechanical, which is mowing, pulling weeds. It just kind of depends on your goals and where you're kind of at in this management process. And then there's cultural efforts, which could be planting native grasses or trees to help compete with the weeds. And so in our plan, the goal was to minimize an over-reliance on herbicides. Part of that is just for the ecosystem health aspects. Herbicides, if not used correctly, can cause some pretty significant damage to waterways and soils. And overusing them and not having a management plan can lead to the development of herbicide-resistant weeds, which we do have quite a big issue with here in the Pacific Northwest. And so this graph is actually from the Victorian government in Australia, but it kind of shows the different stages of weed management. Our plan outlines these stages. We just didn't have a nice picture to show about it. But essentially, we're starting with prevention, trying to keep species out. So that means we're looking at the region around us. Is there species that other counties or other municipalities or neighboring tribes are dealing with that we haven't found yet? And then if we do happen to find some of those species, we're kind of in a eradication aspect of management where we can definitely try to get rid of them from the reservation without spending too much money. These are typically areas with smaller footprints, maybe a few individuals in a very localized area. If you let your weed population grow, we're then kind of getting into a containment and management scenario where eradication is probably out of the question, but we're trying to limit the spread of these weeds into other areas of the reservation or off the reservation if they're not in areas surrounding it. And so this is some of the strategies that our weed management provides us with to kind of determine how we're going to go about managing weeds, because we have thousands and thousands of acres that have noxious weeds on them. They vary in their state listed status. So on the table on the right at the top, it's mentions Class A, Class B, Class C. That's just a statewide prioritization for these weeds, and the Class A ones are highest priority across the state. So we can use those prioritizations with our site priorities there on the left of the table. It may be that the population's small, it's easy to get rid of. It could be that it's in a really important habitat area for certain wildlife species. It could be that it's in a riparian area and it's, you know, there's a threat of it out competing important riparian plants that are necessary for fish habitat. And so we kind of use this table along with the flow chart on the left that is just kind of our guiding strategy for each weed population. We have to start with establishing our management goals. So are we looking for that eradication, or are we just trying to contain it to a specific area? And then we need to map and survey and get an idea of what that population looks like. If we don't have any sort of baseline population estimates of our noxious weeds, and we have no way to determine the success of our treatment methods. So I'm a big proponent of monitoring. I think it can be tough to get funding for it, but it's a very necessary aspect of weed management. If we're just out there spraying and mowing and not doing any follow-up on our treatments, then we don't really know if we're just out there throwing money on the ground or not. And then, so this is just an example of a map we have of our thistle populations. And so we can kind of use our data with those previous two examples to determine where we need to go out and target thistle populations. And then this is just an example out of our weed management plan of various herbicides. I mean, this table was like 7 pages long. It pretty much lists every herbicide we could ever use. And it tells us, you know, how to use it, what kind of group of herbicide it is. So how does it affect the plant? That really helps with preventing weeds from becoming resistant. And then it kind of tells us what weeds that it is really effective at treating. And then we also have an index that lists treatment options for 25 different noxious weed species. And then we're continuously adding onto this ourselves as we find new weeds that we think need to be in our plan. So it talks about our physical, cultural, biological, and herbicide controls, along with some background info. And then for each of those species, it gives us more detailed options for herbicide control. And this allows us to just make sure if we do need to use herbicides that we're using the most effective ones to limit the amount of herbicide that we use at the end of the project. And so having your management plan approved through NEPA really helps with your grant applications. For federal funds to fund projects like this, it needs to go through the NEPA process. For just a quick example, we've been treating flowering rush along the banks of Lake Roosevelt, and we couldn't have gotten funding for that without our finding of no significant impact. And then I had some management strategies, but we'll just kind of skip to the end here to limit the amount of time I'm taking up. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat or reach out to me directly at my email here. And if you want a copy of our weed management plan, it is a public document, so I'd be very happy to share that with you. And thank you for having me, everybody, and I look forward to the rest of the presentations.